There are many courses on music production online. The paid ones can be hit or miss because the industry is full of charlatans looking for a quick buck, and the free courses you tend to get what you pay for. The video you're watching right now is a free online course in compression, so why is it any different? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I'm a professional mastering engineer with almost 20 years of experience, and I'm also the developer of Curvature, which is one of the most innovative compressor plugins currently available. And unlike essentially all of the other music production YouTubers offering plugins, I didn't outsource the development of my plugins to a software company. I coded it entirely myself from scratch. So I can speak from both the perspective of a pro engineer and a plugin developer. So although the course is free, my motivation here is to do such a good job that you might want to support me buying one of my plugins or courses from my website, apmastering.com. Obviously you don't have to. If not, this is just a 100% free course. So let's dive straight in at the most fundamental level possible. So many so-called experts teach that the most important fundamental building blocks in mixing and mastering are EQ and compression and dynamic EQ, or in modern times maybe even spectral processing and stuff like that. No, wrong. Anyone who says that demonstrates their lack of understanding of the bedrock of signal processing, because the most fundamental building block by far is gain. So let's say we have a Neve console with flying faders. One of the faders is turned down low, and across a 2-second period of time, the fader goes up. So a console with flying faders is just processing gain across time. Volume automation in your DAW is gain across time. So what is compression? Compression is gain across time. What is EQ? Gain across different frequencies. What is a dynamic EQ? It's gain across different frequencies across time. What is frequency? That's how many times a sine wave cycles per second. And that's a measurement based on time. So the frequency domain is just the other side of a coin to the time domain, and we can easily switch from one to the other with a Fourier transform. So you can equally see it as time. So the most fundamental tool is gain, and we can do cool stuff with gain across time. Now, of course, anyone is allowed to disagree with what I've just said, but doing so demonstrates your cluelessness. And sorry if I come across brash here, but the industry is absolutely overflowing with self-proclaimed experts trying to teach you stuff when they actually don't know what they're talking about. And that even includes, unfortunately, university lecturers some of the time. So either I can just come on here and perpetuate the same old nonsense, making people feel good about what they think they know, or I can do stuff which is actually valuable and go against the grain and trigger another total meltdown for my industry sponsored haters on Reddit. Well, I choose the latter, so let's get into it. So gain is the most fundamental tool, and compression and EQ are time and frequency based applications of gain. Dynamic EQ is both time and frequency based applications of gain simultaneously. And then people might say, okay, well, what about distortion? Saturation is also a fundamental type of processing in audio production. Well, where does that fit in? Well, you can very easily do wave-shaping distortion with a compressor if you know how to use it. So as you could hear, we could get some pretty substantial distortion out of that sine wave just using one compressor. A lot of people don't know that you can use a compressor as a distortion unit, but you can go way further than that. You can make an entire beat out of just sine waves and compressors. Let's have a look at that now. And so I've got a sine wave on each of these 4 tracks, and then one instance of curvature per track. And you can see on the master, I've got some EQ and another instance of curvature because I'm using the brick wall limiter function just to pump up the volume a bit, but that's not really doing that much. All of what you're hearing, the sound design, is coming from one single sine wave per track and one single instance of curvature per track. and then I'm just using a bit of automation, couple lanes per track to actually make it do stuff. And because sine waves are the least complex wave possible, it's literally just a pure tone with no additional harmonics, there's no filtering or anything like that, all of the rich harmonics that you're hearing is coming from something happening in curvature. So let's press play and see what 4 simple sine waves can sound like with a bit of automation and a few instances of curvature. Here's the kick drum, and when we get rid of curvature, it's just a sine wave. Here's the clap, and when we get rid of curvature, you can't actually hear it because the sine wave is incredibly high pitched. I can bring up an oscilloscope so that we can see that it's just a sine wave, but I'm using the quantum algorithm on curvature to get such harmonic richness out of a single high frequency sine wave. It's essentially turning to noise, and then I can shape it in curvature with automation. The hats, I'm doing a similar kind of thing, and if we disable curvature, we just get really horrible high pitch sine wave. Here's the bass. And it's just a low frequency sine wave. We can see on the oscilloscope there's nothing happening there. I've done a bit of pitch automation here to make it a bit more interesting, but yeah, so there you go, there's no trickery involved. If you have a decent compressor like curvature and you do a bit of automation, you can get dramatically different sounds out of the input signals because you can create harmonically rich content out of even just sine waves if you know how to use it correctly. And like always, I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of haters turn up trying to say that I'm playing tricks and I made another beat earlier and I've replaced it on the video and that's not really what's going on in the session. Well, if you're skeptical, just download the session. I'm going to link it in the description. You can download it, assuming you've got a copy of Reaper and Curvature. You can load it up, play with it, make your own beat out of sine waves and a compressor. And this is the thing, a lot of people don't know how powerful compressors are. You can really do a lot with just one instance of a compressor. So that's why when I see people with their sessions, their mixing sessions, and they've got like 10 different things on each track, they've got multiple compressors and multiple EQ instances, I just think they just don't know how to use the stuff they've got. They don't know how to get the best out of each instance of the compressor or EQ that they're using in their session. So they have to have a whole bunch of different ones because they just don't know what they're doing. It's much better just to learn your tools and not have a whole bunch of different plugins chucked on everything. It's way better if you just learn your tools. And so that's what I really want to do in this video. I'm hoping by the end of this course, you can really get a lot out of this and understand how to use one compressor very well. Now, of course, I'm biased. I would like you to buy my compressor Curvature and use that. And I do genuinely believe that it's one of the most exciting and innovative compressors on the market currently. That's why I made it the way that I did, and I put a lot of effort into making it that way. However, all of these concepts that I'm teaching you in this course apply one-to-one to pretty much any compressor on the market which is sufficiently advanced to feature the controls to the concepts that I'm teaching here. So although I think that most of the other compressors on the market are boring in comparison, there are many compressors which are sufficiently advanced to do everything that I'm talking about in this course and more. Compressors like Compassion, for example. The thing is, I personally think that it's extremely expensive, and if you want to use my quantum algorithm or the Scholes algorithm that I made for my curvature compressor, well, Curvature is the only thing in the world that currently does that. But let's get back to our Venn diagram, because although you can cause really cool sounding distortion with a compressor, typically it would be seen in a different category, not gain across time, but it would be gain across gain. What does that mean? It means that the gain applied is determined by the input gain. And many vintage compressors like Tube and FET designs also cause distortion in addition to the effects of their compression. So they can be seen as a mix of gain across time and gain across gain. And if we have a stereo signal, we can also adjust the gain of each channel. So that affects the balance. But if we take the sum and difference of those channels, we can change the width of the stereo image, for example. And if we take the side channel and apply a high pass filter, we create what is typically referred to in the mastering trade as an elliptical filter. And if we combine all of those things into one product, we arrive at a classic large format studio console from the 80s, like an SSL or a Neve. And before that, engineers relied more heavily on racks of outboard gear because the board itself, the mixing console, didn't have gates and compressors and more complex stuff baked into it. So when consoles such as the SSL 4K arrived on the scene, studio consoles had essentially achieved the pinnacle of excellence. And sure, many people still like the sound of certain outboard effects, but ultimately, if you can't mix a record on an SSL 4K, it's a skill issue and not a gear issue. And in terms of reverb and delay, every decent studio in the 80s and 90s had a Lexicon 480L Lark sitting right in the center of their console. And that's the classic studio setup that many of the best records were mixed with. So that's why, in my personal opinion, you shouldn't bother trying to learn any other stuff before you have nailed EQ and compression. Now, I already taught EQ in my most popular course, EQ Enlightenment, and today, in this video, I'm teaching compression. Those things together, you're going to be unstoppable, and then everything else is just going to be more creative, exotic effects, like no one needs a course on how to use a flanger. So far, we've just been getting warmed up and learning some key concepts, and before we dive into more, I want to talk about the structure quickly, because this is just one big long YouTube video. And whereas on my website it's organized into chapters and different videos, here it's just one big long thing. So the chapter markers down below. However, the way that I've made it, I'm gonna start off at kind of a noob level and then progress until we get to a level where most people will be listening and genuinely hearing new stuff that they've never encountered before. And it's gonna get increasingly more difficult until at some point it's just gonna be too technical for you. And that's okay, because that's the idea, that's the way I've designed it. And you can leave a comment down below, a timestamp of how far you got before tapping out. But in fact, my goal is that nobody should reach the end of the course the first time around. Otherwise, I've made it too easy. Because if you're a complete beginner, you're going to learn everything you need up until when it gets too technical, and then just close the video and come back in a week and pick up where you left off, and you'll get further that next time and further every time you watch. So make sure to bookmark this video so you can find it again and come back to it and just use this as a resource until you're very comfortable with compression. So first things first, what even is a compressor in the first place? Maybe there's some people watching this who aren't that familiar with what a compressor actually is. Maybe you've just used it as an effect, but you don't really know what it is. So let's start at the basics. Imagine a robot, and the robot's job is to turn stuff down if it gets too loud. So if something sounds uneven in loudness because some things are too loud and some things are too quiet, well, compressor can help to even that out. So for example, I can talk really quietly, and this is going to be a dramatically different level to when I talk really loud, because this is no longer going to be the same level as it was before, so we need to balance it out. Let's take that clip of what I just said and run it through a compressor plugin. So for example, I can talk really quietly, and this is going to be a dramatically different level to when I talk really loud, because this is no longer going to be the same level as it was before, so we need to balance it out. So this top one, I've just bounced that processing out so we can see the waveform, and the first half is almost the same as the second half, whereas on the original one you can see that the first half is significantly quieter than the second half. That's the raw take, where we didn't have the compressor on it, and you can see where we do have the compressor, it balances it out, makes it a lot more even. But you don't only just level things out with the compressor, you can also make stuff sound fatter. So if you take a drum loop, for example, you can transform it from sounding a bit raw to sounding more pumped up and fat. But you can also do other stuff as well, like take, for example, if you have a bass guitar which has a clicky sounding onset to the notes, or that can kind of jump out the mix and sound disturbing sometimes, so you can get rid of those clicky bits from the start by targeting just the start of the notes with the compressor. Another cool thing you can do is making your mix pump to the kick drum. This is called sidechain compression, and it's very popular in certain styles of electronic music, but you can use it in any type of music. And you can do that sidechain compression just with the bass line and the kick drum. So when the kick drum plays, it squashes down the bass line. So normally those two elements fight or compete for space in the mix, but you can just prioritize the kick drum over the bass line by using a compressor with a sidechain input. So a compressor can do really cool stuff. It can emphasize the start of the note, and it can de-emphasize the start of the note. It can make things more even, and it can even make things less even. And you might be thinking, that doesn't make any sense. How can it do opposite things? A typical answer you might get to that question from people who don't really know what they're talking about is, well, there's many different flavors of compression, and there's this vintage compressor and that vintage compressor, and you just need to listen to them all and figure out what one sounds best on that particular instrument. No, that's just a wishy-washy answer you get from people who don't really know what they're talking about. I made a plugin called Delta Expose, so you can just literally see exactly what a compressor is doing, and it's not that hard to explain what a compressor is doing or how it can do those opposite things if you just look at what it's doing, and so we can look at exactly that right now. So on the left we have our compressor plugin, and on the right we have our Delta Expose Analyzer plugin. What is this showing? Well, if a loud sound occurs here, the compressor is going to squish it down. Because remember, the compressor is just like a robot. If it detects a loud sound, it will turn down the gain, it will turn down the fader. So there's a loud sound here, the compressor squishes it down. And it remains squished down until the loud sound is over. And then the compressor returns back to the normal gain. Now, how fast is it squished down? We can make it squish down quicker by making the attack time shorter. Or we can make it squish down in a longer period by making the attack time longer. So when we change the attack time, we can see that update on the Analyzer plugin. And the same goes for the release time. We can make the release shorter and we can make the release longer. We can see that intuitively on the Analyzer plugin. However, these are straight lines. Normally, it doesn't work like that on a classic sounding compressor, that it goes straight down in a straight line like this, and then it goes back up, it recovers in a straight line, because this is a special algorithm on curvature which doesn't sound like classic compressors, because this is intended to be straight lines. These are curves which are way more typical in normal compressors, and we can see that a longer attack time or shorter attack time, it does exactly the same thing. But instead of being a straight line here, it's more of a curve. So when the compressor kicks in, it kicks in fast at the start and then slower, and it slows down until it achieves its maximum gain reduction. And then the same with the release stage. It recovers more quickly and then it slows down until it reaches its normal state of no gain reduction. And we can see that if we make it so fast that it's 0, then it just immediately kicks in. It's just a straight line down. It happens instantaneously. So if you imagine this instantaneous gain reduction, it's going to erode the onset of a note. It's going to get rid of any clickiness or any transient at the start of the note because it's just going to squish down straight away. Whereas if I drag out the attack time, make that longer, well, now the note is going to be able to have a chance for the start to come through before the compressor starts turning it down. So then you can emphasize the start of the note and then the rest of the note is then turned down. And this is emphasized differently with different compression models. So if this is the logarithmic model, but if we go to analog, you see that it's slightly different. It emphasizes the start even more because the very start of the note can come through before it really starts to do anything at all. There's a slight delay before it starts to do something, and then it starts to increase very quickly the gain reduction and then slow it down. And the release stage is also interesting with the analog model because it will start to gently decrease the gain reduction, speed it up, and then decrease and then go to 0. So it's more of an S curve here, whereas linear is very straight and angular, and you can see these sharp transition points. Well, there is a control called apex to make that a bit more rounded. So you can see now that the corner has been rounded off, and if we put that back down, we have this more hard corner. So we can really see what is happening with the shape of the compression curves when we analyze them in delta expose. And we can use this not just on curvature but on any compressor plugin to examine what's going on with the shapes. But it's very intuitive when looking at this graph what the compressor is going to sound like. And this is going to sound more choppy and less smooth and natural than something like the analog mode. We can see that's way more smooth. So as we've already discussed, and you can see in delta expose, when a compressor encounters a loud sound, it ducks it down in level. It reduces the gain reduction. But the thing is, how quickly that happens or how slowly that happens can affect the sound in different ways. So if it ducks it down really quickly, so quickly that it grabs the start of the note, it can erode the initial transient and make it sound less clicky or less punchy. And people often think that a fast attack increases the punchiness. No, it doesn't. It's the opposite of the truth. If you have a really fast attack, it's so fast that it erodes the initial transient, it makes it less punchy. It takes away punch because it erodes the start of the note. So if we get some compression which has an instantaneous attack, and we see that on delta expose that it ducks right down on the first sample, and then we get a snare hit, what do you think is going to happen to the sound of our snare? Is it going to get more punchy, or is it going to get less punchy? Well, it's going to get less punchy because we're going to cut off the transient of the start, because it's going to smash down the level on the first sample. So we're not going to get any punch at the start at all. We're just going to smash that down. And then because the sound of a snare naturally decays over time, all the gain reduction is going to go back to normal in our release phase. So what we're going to do is we're just going to have a really flat sounding, inflated kind of snare, which is almost sounds like a cat sneeze or something. Whereas if we have a longer attack time, it's going to let the initial transient through first, so we get a big amount of punch, and then it's going to make the rest of the snare fat. So we get fatness of the rest of the snare of the body and still get a transient there. So that can make a snare sound really fat with a slightly longer attack time. That's why it's not best to make the attack as fast as possible. People often get mistaken with that, and they go for the fastest attack sound, and They think that's the punchiest thing. It's often not. You want a slightly slower attack to get more punch, more transient coming through. So that's how we can emphasize or de-emphasize the start based on the attack time. And we can even stuff out or make stuff less even based on the attack and release times. So there's nothing contradictory about that. It can do different things based on the times that you specify. So this is where I anticipate that people will turn up in the comments and disagree with me and say, well, there's many highly regarded vintage analog units which don't have such good control over time constants and all of these parameters. So ultimately, you do need to find the compressor which suits the mix, because lots of people prefer this compressor and that compressor, and they don't have the full feature set that you would require to dial in the sound manually. So it is about just finding the right compressor for the job. And again, this is just a demonstration of cluelessness. The LA2A, just like all compressors, do indeed have attack and release values. They're just not layman accessible. But many vintage LA2As that have actually been used in real working studios probably had the capacitor responsible for the release time swapped at some point or another, and the opto cells inside are actually different between units. So anyone who thinks that an LA2A has one specific classic sound is just demonstrating their ignorance there, and the marketing around the LA2A plugins pretty much just relies on the fact that their customers don't know how to read the schematic. So it's impossible for a compressor not to have attack and release times, whether they're user tweakable or not. There needs to be some specification of the speed at which the gain reduction is applied and released, otherwise you simply don't have an effect which resembles compression. Threshold is very easy to understand, but many people get it wrong because they don't really understand how the gain structure is working. So let's draw another diagram. Let's say we have a threshold and we have an input signal. Some amount of the input signal is exceeding the threshold here. But we can take the threshold and we can make the threshold lower, or we can make the threshold higher. If we make the threshold higher, well, now none of the input signal is exceeding the threshold, and so our compressor isn't working at all there. Whereas if we put it down low, now most of the input signal is exceeding the threshold, and so the compressor is going to work quite hard. But if we put the threshold back to where it was before, we can do it the other way around as well. We can turn down our input signal, and now the threshold is not being exceeded, so our compressor isn't working. Or we can just turn up the input signal, and now a lot of the input signal is exceeding the threshold. Now compressor is working a lot harder. You can turn the threshold down so it smashes into the input signal, or you can turn the input signal up so it smashes into the threshold. But the two things are functionally identical. Many compressors have auto gain compensation, otherwise called auto gain makeup. And in my opinion, this is bad. And the reason relates to psychoacoustic trickery, where humans tend to prefer stuff when it's a bit louder. And that means if something is louder but less good, you'll prefer it over something which is better but quieter. And auto makeup almost always overcompensates and just makes stuff louder. Its explanation isn't that important here, but what is important is that auto makeup tricks you into thinking that the compression sounds better than it actually does. And that's why professionals do not use, or at least should not use, auto makeup. So when you use a compressor, you should aim to manually adjust the output gain to maintain a consistent level, so you're not tricked. So when you bypass it, it's not quieter than it is in its enabled state. You don't want to enable the compressor and have a bump in level and be like, oh, that sounds great just because it's louder. No, you want it to have an equal level so that you can compare it before and after and it have a constant level, so you're not tricked by that loudness. But going further than that, this is why curvature, for example, does the opposite of auto gain compensation. So when you turn up the input gain, it turns down the output gain to make it quieter. And you might think, well, that's the 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. With auto gain compensation, when you turn the level, the threshold down, or it turns the gain up. Well, there's a subtle difference to that, because when you turn the threshold down, let's say the sound hasn't really met the threshold yet. Well, when you turn it down, it's already turning up the output gain when you turn the threshold down, despite the fact it's not having much gain reduction yet. Well, that means that you're going to always err on the side of turning it up too loud. So it's tending to be louder than the original signal. Whereas the other way around, when you turn up the input signal, it might have not met the threshold yet, but you're still turning it down. So you're going to have a 1-to-1 configuration between the input gain and the output gain. So it's not going to have any change in volume, because it's going to like do the opposite motion. So it's going to have a stable volume until it starts hitting the gain reduction, hitting threshold and triggering gain reduction, and then it's going to turn it down 1-to-1 in addition to the gain reduction. So it's going to turn it down more. So it tends to be quieter with that method, whereas the auto gain compensation tends to be louder with that method. So if you want to go for one of those approaches, the best approach is to err on the side of having it quieter than the input signal. So if the compressor is doing something that you genuinely like the sound of, even when it's quieter, you should be able to prefer it. Because if you're just like, no, I don't know if it's really doing something that I like, then just get rid of the compressor. It's better to not compress at all than to just think that you need to use it or be tricked by a bump in loudness. And no, the best thing to do is to not use any compressor at all if you're not sure. You need to be sure that it sounds good. So that's why on curvature, it is the way that it is, that it errs on the side of making it quieter rather than louder. So you're not tricked. So when you like the sound of the compressor, you really do like the sound of the compressor, despite the fact that it might actually be even quieter than it started off with. And then when you A/B it, you still like the sound of it, despite the fact that this is a tiny bit quieter. Of course, you can adjust that manually to make it matched. But in the default case, it errs on the side of being quieter. Let's now look at some of the most popular compression techniques. Let's start off with New York style compression. So you may or may not have heard of New York style compression, and some people online say it's some magical secret thing that only the pros know about, but it's not so secret, and I'm going to show you it right now. So if you want to compress something, traditionally you will load up a compressor on that thing, and now you're compressing that thing. Well done. However, New York style compression is different because we don't compress the thing itself. What we do is we make a duplicate and we send a duplicate of the signal to that track. So if I press play, both tracks will be playing at the same time. And then we put a compressor on the duplicate. So we can call this one C for compressed. And what we'll do is we'll solo this and we'll get a setting which is like really smashed with like fast time constants, and we'll just really smash the signal. Okay, so I think you will agree that's a really smashed version of that signal. And what we can do is put that on minus infinity, take it off solo. Now we just hear the original. And what we do is we slowly introduce the smashed signal into the clean signal. And the idea behind New York style compression is that we don't affect the original signal at all. All we do is add some smash signal underneath it to support it, and we're not actually affecting the original signal whatsoever. We're just adding some additional compression to it. Now, I actually disagree with this way of thinking, and I'll explain that now. Now, there's some people who insist that New York style compression is fundamentally different from a wet and dry knob on a compressor. No, it's not. If you think that, you're wrong, and I'll explain why. So let's say that you have the dry fader and the wet fader, and the wet fader of the compressed signal is on minus infinity. Imagine now a pie chart representing the totality of the sound that you're hearing. So whether the totality of the sound that you're hearing is loud or whether it is quiet, it doesn't matter, because the totality of the sound is 100% of the pie chart, so the pie. The more that you turn up that fader of the compressed signal, the larger the percentage in the pie chart of the process signal. And you're saying, okay, no, but I'm adding to it. No, you can't get more than 100% of the pie chart. You have 100% of the pie chart, which is the pie, and the pie is what you were hearing. So the totality of what you were hearing is the pie, right? And some percentage of that, which is what you were hearing, is going to be the process signal, and some percentage is going to be the dry signal. And if you keep turning up the wet signal louder and louder and louder, it's at some point going to be 80%, 90% of the pie chart. How is that any different to a wet and dry knob? The only difference is the fact that when you keep turning up faders, everything it gets louder and louder and louder, but then you just turn down the output gain. So it's a gain structure thing. But fundamentally, in terms of the wet and dry knob, it's identical to having faders. Whether you got faders or you got a knob, it doesn't really matter. It's doing the same thing functionally. You're just expressing some percentage of that sound is going to be wet and some is going to be dry. Whether that's expressed on faders or on a wet and dry knob, it's the same thing. So on curvature, if you take the wet and dry knob and turn it from 100% to some percentage lower than 100, you are now doing New York style compression. So I previously mentioned sidechain compression, where, for example, you could have the kick drum ducking down the bass line or ducking down the rest of the mix. That's quite popular, as I mentioned, in many styles of electronic music. Now, let's have a look how to do that. So we have a kick drum and we have a pad. And we want to sidechain the pad to the kick drum such that when the kick drum plays, the pad is reduced in loudness. The way that we do that is by putting a compressor on the pad, and we can send a duplicate of the signal to this track in the sidechain input. In the case of Reaper, we'd just say channels 3 and 4, because over here the sidechain input is 3 and 4. So we can go to the sidechain page of curvature. We want to say external sidechain, and when we hit play, that's already going to be doing it. That's as simple as it gets, pretty much. It's super simple. So with curvature, you press one button to do that. Of course, you can tweak that more. You can play with the algorithms, and you can play with the attack and release times. And do whatever you want, but in essence, you just go to the sidechain page and click external sidechain. That's it. Pretty simple stuff. So that's how we sidechain a kick drum to the pad, or anything else. This could be a bass guitar. It could be a sub bass. It could be anything you wanted, and that could, instead of being a kick drum, it could be anything. You can do this with sidechain anything to anything else, and I often use this when creating electronic music to do interesting kind of interplay between different elements. It's an incredibly important technique. This is one of the most foundational techniques in making interesting sound in music. If you don't do this multiple times every time you mix, whether you're mixing rock or metal or whatever electronic music, you need to know this technique because it's so important. And in most kind of like guitar driven type genres, the most common thing that you're going to do is use a bit of that on the bass guitar and the kick drum so that you can create a bit more space there. But you can also do it in other places as well. You can have the vocal predominating over the guitars maybe, or some other element, and just do like a really subtle amount. Maybe turn down the like the mix a lot so that you just get a bit of that effect if it's too much. And there's a lot of things you can do with this. It really is one of the most fundamental things that you can do in a mix with dynamics. It's so important, but a lot of people don't even do it that often. It is very popular. That's why most good quality compressors, whether it's a plugin or hardware unit, will probably have a sidechain input. There are some exceptions to that, but this is such an important technique, you really can't go without it. Some more advanced compressors have look-ahead functionality. Curvature has look-ahead, so we can see what we can do with that. And one of the key things you can do when you have look-ahead is destroy transients. And that obviously isn't a good thing most of the time, but sometimes it can be exactly what you want to do. For example, what I was talking about earlier with the clicky bassline sound, you can just destroy that initial transient and make it much smoother and warmer sounding rather than having that horrible clicky start, which you might not want. So this here is a clicky sounding bassline. We can even see the clicks in the waveform because it's so clicky on the onset of the notes. And I've come up with a compressor setting to try and reduce that slightly. I could just go full here like 0, but in this case, I'm just going to go to 10 millisecond attack and try and reduce the clickiness of the start of the attack slightly with this compressor. And what I've also done is I've hit the high pass button and applied that to the sidechain detector circuit. So what the compressor is seeing to compress is way more clicky and has way less bass because I've high pass filtered it. So we can hear the original with the compressor setting, and then I can put on the look ahead time of 1 millisecond, and we can see if that does anything else to additionally erode the clickiness there at the start of the notes. And then I'll listen to the unprocessed audio finally. You can compare and hear what you think of the differences. So I think you'll agree that with the compressor on, it significantly reduces the clickiness, the transient of the onset of the bass notes. However, with look ahead enabled, it's even more kind of prominent, this effect. It's eroding the transients even more than with it off. That's because the compressor acts slightly early, because when we have a compressor acting in a normal way, when this transient exceeds the threshold, the compressor kicks in and starts applying gain reduction. But maybe it's not quick enough to get rid of this start because it would need to act quicker because the start is so short. So what we can do instead is apply a look ahead time. So it can, instead of starting here and then applying the gain reduction there, and we've basically missed it, we can start here and start applying the gain reduction so we turn it down by the time it's there. Now that's just really approximate what I'm saying here with the timing, but hopefully you understand what I mean. Although many people like a really fast attack, for example an 1176 compressor on a bass guitar, or maybe the ambient mics of a drum kit, something like this, to crush those down and feed it back into the mix, that can sound really great. But when you're working on the whole mix for bus compression, and maybe you're doing compression in mastering or something like this, that's really not the type of compression you want to use. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of what you want to do. In fact, for mastering and the classic mix bus compression, which a lot of people know and love the sound of, that's actually a slow attack. Using a slow attack and a fast release is how you get that sound. So we can demo that now. So this is an example track, and I've got a compressor setting here which is similar to that of an 1176 if you have a stereo pair of them on your mix bus and you did a fast attack and a slow release. And we can see how this sounds. I don't think this sounds good at all, and we can listen to that now. And yeah, let's just have a listen. So it hasn't contributed anything nice to the sound whatsoever. It's just made it lethargic and slightly more distorted. It's just like someone came and sat on top of your mix. It's just deflated it, made it lethargic, and hasn't added anything. It's not a good sound, for the master bus. That might be a fantastic sound for a bass guitar, but it's not a very good sound for the master bus. So that's why it's not very common to have a stereo pair of an 1176s across your master bus. It's not the best sound. The sound which is a lot more desirable, and which a lot more hardware units which are deemed bus compressors gravitate towards in terms of their time constants, is a slower attack. Let's say something like 30 or 40 would do well, and then a much faster release, something from 100 all the way down to, let's do 50 in this case. Let's see how this sounds. I might need to adjust the gain structure slightly. So I'm obviously exaggerating with the amount of gain reduction that I'm applying, the amount of compression here. If you wanted that sound, you'd either do that and dial it back, or you would dial back the ratio. So this is obviously very much exaggerated, but at least you can hear in the character of that compressor that it sounds way better than the first one. Now, I'm not entirely convinced that the track actually needs a lot of compression on the master bus, and I don't generally slap compression that often on the master bus just for the sake of it. A lot of people do, I don't really. But when I did put it on with that particular arrangement of time constants, you can hear that it adds more of a cool sound, like the mix is pumping and it's more lively and it's more exciting and lively, rather than lethargic and deflated. It's almost the opposite. So really, a lot of people get this wrong. A lot of people say, I want to really have some kind of punchy sound, so I need a really short attack time. No, the punchy sound is made from the slow attack. And obviously that is much slower, but that's just going too far. A slow attack is already something about 40 when it comes to attacks. Considering the 1176, the slowest the attack can go is somewhere like 1 millisecond. It's an incredibly fast compressor. And so that's why you don't really use an 1176 on the master bus. You'd use something more like an SSL bus compressor on the master bus, because in my opinion, the best sounding attack time is 30 milliseconds, which is way better than 0.1 or something from the 1176. So 1176s are amazing compressors, but you have to use it for the right thing. So hopefully that's quite self-evident from listening to it. It sounds way better with a slow attack and fast release than it does with a fast attack and slow release. Now, obviously you have to find the setting, the times that work best for your particular taste in music, but you should, hopefully you agree that this configuration of attack and release times sounded way better than the first one. And it's pretty much regardless of the genre. I could get any kind of track here, and if it needs some kind of bus compression in the first place, which a lot of the time it doesn't, but let's say it did, then these settings are going to work, whatever it is, way better than the first one, because the first one is just not that sensible as a mix bus setting. Now, obviously, I don't want to do a streaky and say, this will work every single time. Of course, it won't work every single time, because you need to know if it even needs it in the first place. But if it does need some kind of mix bus compression, this is a very good starting point, something like this. And if you want it to be a bit more refined, maybe add a bit of RMS, reduce the ratio a bit, maybe less of that, and you might have a sound that you really like. sometimes you might want to use mix bus compression. So you want to compress across your whole mix, but for some reason the kick drum is really triggering the gain reduction and it's really messing up the mix. It's sounding way too pumpy when the kick comes in, or maybe the bass guitar, or there's some bass element which is really triggering the compressor and making it sound weird. And in fact, it doesn't even really sound all that compressed. It just sounds like more pumpy and weird because of the bass. And you don't like that. You want to change that. You want to get a different sound to the compressor. So some people might just reach for a different compressor. But the trick here is to high pass filter the sidechain and reduce the amount that the compressor is getting triggered by the bass frequencies and emphasize more of the mid frequencies and potentially also higher frequencies rather than just those sub bass frequencies which are very strong and can trigger the gain reduction. Check out this bass heavy track with this compression setting. It's sounding distorted, flat, squashed, not good. The compressor's getting triggered left, right and center from all of the bass in the bass line, the sub, the kick is just not working out very well at all with this compressor setting. And the thing is, this isn't necessarily a bad compressor setting. It's just not working because all that bass is messing it up. And there's nothing wrong with that bass, it's just not working with that compressor. So what we can do is go into the sidechain tab of curvature, pick out the high pass filter, apply it to the sidechain detector path, and now that's gonna high pass filter what the compressor is seeing or hearing, and it's going to get all that bass out of the way, and we can focus on the mids and highs of the track and see if we can get any cool compression that way. Sounds way better. Let's compare the two. Can you hear how the one without any EQ just sounds completely squashed, distorted and flat, and with the high pass filter it sounds way better, and then we can actually get some more meaningful compression on the snares and the rest of the mix as opposed to just triggering it the whole time with bass. Now again, I'm not saying that this particular mix really necessarily needs this kind of compression, I'm just giving you the technique. Now I already showed right at the start of the course how you can create distortion with the compressor, and that's pretty much just having quick attack and release times. And if you put them on 0, both the attack and release, now you've essentially just got a clipper. That's just a hard clipper. If it is genuinely 0 samples or it reacts straight away and it doesn't really have any attack or release time, it's just instantaneous, that is by definition a clipper, and that's not something that I really recommend using. If you've got curvature, just lower the ceiling and then you've got a distortion, a saturation, which sounds a lot nicer than using a clipper. But you can really play with those attack and release times, especially with automation, in the way that I was showing at the start of this course, and you can get some really interesting effects, especially if you want to cause distortion, you want to maybe make a bass guitar more gritty, then you can use very short attack and release times, maybe 1, 2, 3 milliseconds, something like that, and you can really introduce a lot of distortion. So now we understand the basic mechanics of a compressor. We have a threshold, we have an input signal, and when the input signal exceeds the threshold, it will be turned down by some amount, gain reduction will occur, and when the sound gets quieter and goes below the threshold, well then the gain reduction will revert to 0. And it doesn't happen instantaneously. There is an attack time and a release time in which it goes back to 0 gain reduction. Now, knowing that, we might be able to start to think how we can construct a compressor from scratch. Now, if you've got a hardware Eurorack setup, or you can play about with modules and patch stuff in, especially if you've got maths, for example, you could make a compressor if you've got some cool stuff. Not everyone has got access to expensive Eurorack hardware modules, but everyone has access to VCV rack. So I'm here in VCV rack and I've got a drum loop looping around here. We've already heard this drum loop. And I can dump it into the oscilloscope and we see the same thing we see in the waveform. And as most people know watching this video, or hopefully you know, audio waveform goes positive and negative. So 0 volts is the center line here and it goes positive volts and negative volts. But control voltages in modular synthesizers, they go from, often you'll want the voltage to be between 0 and 10 volts, for example. And so we've got some modules down here which work with control voltages. And if I just dump this into this slew limiter here, this is a slew limiter module, and slew limiter essentially just smooths out the waveform and produces a control voltage out the other side. Or if we look at that, now we're getting a very different representation here. And what we're seeing is, with the loud parts of the drum loop, the line is going up slightly to indicate a higher level, and it's coming back down when it's quieter. And we can amplify this using this mixer here. I've chained it together so we can get maximum gain here, and then we can see we're getting way more gain, and we're kind of just getting a depiction of when the drum loop is playing loud, the line is higher, and when it's playing less loud, it's going lower. We can actually see this quite well. Instead of looking at the oscilloscope, we can put it directly here into this VCA and we get a nice depiction here. And if we listen to the sound of the drum loop whilst watching that, we see that the end result of what the slew limiter is doing here, once we've amplified it, is essentially just a VU meter at this point. So when the signal is loud, we're seeing it's coming up here higher up, and when it's less loud, it's further down. And we can adjust the attack and release times of this slew limiter to smooth out the voltage in different ways. And you might be thinking, okay, that's good, but that's just a representation. How do we actually make a compressor then? Well, what we can do is we can get the audio signal out of this looper and just dump it into the VCA here and take the output of that and listen to that. But that doesn't sound as expected. It sounds more like a gate than a compressor. Well, that's exactly right, because what we're doing here is we're saying when it's loud, we want to amplify it, and when it's quiet, we don't want to amplify it. So it's essentially working exactly the same as a gate would work. So that's why it sounds like a gate, because it's functioning as a gate here. What we need to do to make our compressor is to simply invert that. So we can take the output from the mixer, which we've amplified, and put it into this module here, and then put that into the VCA with an offset, so it's currently on the maximum loudness. But then we can do an inverse, so this is a kind of an attenuverter, so we can invert the signal, so instead of adding, it's subtracting. And of course, the amount of negative gain that we're applying to the control voltage is essentially our ratio. So if we back that off, we'll be backing off our ratio. So maybe not the best sounding compressor in the world. We could probably make it sound a bit better if we tweaked it a bit more. But that's essentially the principle. You just take a copy of the signal, put it through a slew limiting circuit, invert that, amplify it, and run the input signal through a VCA or some other type of amplifier. And there you go. You have your compressor. So far, we have gone with the assumption that when the input signal exceeds the threshold, it will be turned down some amount. But I've never really said what this amount is. Well, that depends on the ratio. So we have an input signal and we have a threshold. So obviously this peak here has exceeded our threshold, and the distance between there and there, between the threshold and the actual level that this peak is, that distance is, let's say it's 10 dB. Well, if we have a ratio of 2 to 1, it's like we're putting a divide sign under that with the 2. And 10 divided by 2, what does that equal? It equals 5. So if that was 10 dB, half of that, let's say it's 5 dB, well, that's where it's going to be reduced down to, theoretically. So it's saying if it's 10 dB and the ratio is 2 to 1, we halve it, and so the 5 dB over the threshold, that's the target. It's going to have 5 dB of gain reduction applied to it. Now, if we have, for example, a 4 to 1 ratio, and we replace this here with a 4, what does that equal? 2.5. So it's going to end up somewhere here. So the original peak, instead of being 10 dB exceeding the threshold, it's now just going to be 2.5 dB exceeding the threshold. So there's 7.5 dB of gain reduction. Now if we do 8 to 1, then get rid of that. We have an 8. What is this? Well, it's going to be 1.25. So that's, let's say, here somewhere. And you can see that, firstly, we started with this big jump with 1 to 2. 1 to 2 did a lot. But then, doubling that only got us a little bit. It's only half as much as that. And then doubling it as well, again, only gave us half as much. So every time we double it, we only get half as much difference in the gain reduction. So if we double this again to 16 to 1, we're only going to get a small amount. And then 32 to 1, we're going to get an even smaller amount. So the difference between 8 to 1 and 100 billion quadrillion to 1 is not really that much. So that's why in compressors, sometimes you see infinity as the ratio. But the difference from infinity, between infinity and 8 is not really that much. Maybe by the time you get to 20 or something, you're doing so much compression already. The ratio is so high already that there's very much limiting returns to go from 20 to 1 to infinity to 1. You're not really making, because each time you go up, you get a smaller amount that it's actually doing here. So a lot of people are confused and they think, yeah, but I want a lot of compression. I want big fat compression. So I want a really big ratio to do a lot. So I want something like, I don't know, like 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 50,000, 100,000, a million, a billion. It's just a misunderstanding of how basic mathematics works here, because we're talking about a ratio. So by the time we get to something like 8 to 1, it's already a sufficient amount of compression to do pretty much any type of compression you want to do. That's why people consider 4 to be limiting already. You're already limiting the signal essentially by the time you get to 4. So going to 20, that is more than sufficient. So anyone who thinks that you need like infinity to have like the sound that you want, you're mistaken. You can do the sound that you want with even 4 or 8 most of the time if you know how to use a compressor correctly. Some compressors have a control called knee, and the best way to understand this is to continue what we were just saying about ratio. So the input signal exceeds the threshold, and then it is turned down by some amount determined by the ratio. And if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, nothing happens, because what is any number divided by a 1? It's the same number, nothing happens. But if you divide it by a 2, well, now we're going to halve it. So if the distance between the threshold and where the input signal is that much, and we've got a 1-to-2 ratio, then the gain reduction will be kind of half that distance, so it will turn it down kind of half. But it's kind of like when it goes over the threshold, the ratio is applied instantly. So it's like whatever the signal value is over the threshold, we're going to turn it down by ratio x, whatever we have set. So below the threshold, it's like 1-to-1, nothing is happening. But as soon as it goes above the threshold, now we're applying the ratio. Well, what if we could say, well, down here we want to have 1-to-1 regardless, and up here we want to have the actual ratio that we've selected. But somewhere in between, some kind of like fuzziness between nothing happening and the full gain reduction happening, or the full ratio being applied up here, we want some kind of transition area. So the onset of the ratio isn't just 1-to-1 or whatever it is, so kind of like the selected value or nothing at all. It's like gradual. And so this is seen to be a more smooth kind of compression. Some people will think it's more gluey, and a lot of people are a fan of this kind of compression. I personally am not such a fan of this compression. I don't think it is all that kind of revolutionary or anything, because a lot of people say, well, it's a smooth onset, whereas if you have a hard knee, it's hard, so it's like there's nothing and then there's everything. It's kind of almost like digital clipping, people think, but that's just a misunderstanding of how it's applied. Because let's say something exceeds the threshold by 0.1 dB, for example, and it's got a 2-to-1 ratio. Well, the amount that we're turning it down by is 0.05 dB. It's a tiny amount. So that's a really, really small amount that it's been turned down by, because it's only exceeded it by a small amount. But if it exceeds it by 10 dB, then we turn it down by, let's say, 5 dB. And so that's a much larger amount. So the more a signal exceeds the threshold by, the more it's going to be turned down. So it's not instantaneous, you're crossing the threshold and all of a sudden you're getting turned down 50 dB or something, like some digital off and on hard cut. It's not like that at all, because the higher the input signal goes above the threshold, the more the compressor starts turning it down. It's a very gradual thing anyway. So a knee just makes a gradual process even more gradual. This kind of ties into the next type of compression that I want to talk about, which is kind of glue compression. So one of the most popular compressors that are used as this kind of glue sound is the SSL mix bus compressor, the one which is baked right into the SSL 4K console. And because SSL consoles were so popular in the 80s and 90s, everyone who had such a console had the compressor, or almost everyone had the compressor right there in the middle of the console. So all you have to do is press a button and now you've got it across your mix. So of course it got used a lot, and of course a lot of people associated that with certain records and a certain sound. Can you achieve that same sound with other compressors? Of course you can. There's nothing magical about the SSL bus compressor. Yes, it's legendary because a lot of people used it and a lot of people like the aesthetics and associate that aesthetics with a certain sound. But just because people associate it with a certain sound, it doesn't mean you can't get that sound elsewhere. And of course you can get that sound elsewhere. It's just a typical standard kind of VCA compression sound with nothing really that special going on. But the way that people often use it is to have a fairly gentle ratio and then quite a low threshold. So they're really applying a lot of compression over everything, but just a little bit of compression over everything. And this kind of sound, people claim that it glues everything together and smushes everything together in the mix and kind of makes everything come together and be more cohesive in the mix and act for and kind of serve the mix in a way where if there was elements popping out before and it didn't sound like everything was mixed in its right place, well, this will smash it into place and make it smooth and nice and glued together. I don't really agree. I think that's a nice way to kind of conceptualize what you might like it to do or what people think it might do. It doesn't glue stuff together, because if you've got a bad mix where stuff is disharmonious in the mix and it's not coming together in a nice way, just slapping on a compressor isn't just magically gonna all glue it together and make it now sound like everything's in its right place. Of course not. You have to have a good mix in the first place in order for the SSL bus compressor to even produce a good sound anyway, because if you've got a bad sound on the way in, then you're probably going to have a bad sound on the way out, coming out the compressor. So the compressor is kind of, what it does is, it kind of makes everything pump together in a nice way, and kind of, it doesn't glue stuff together, it kind of gives more like a fatter, more kind of polished sound, and it's hard to describe with adjectives and stuff, because a lot of people lean into the marketing hype and they say, oh, it's this legendary warm sound with all of these adjectives. So actually picking adjectives that fit to it is quite tricky, because at the end of the day, it's just a compressor. It's a fairly basic, normal, standard compressor that you can just replicate with pretty much anything else. And the reason why it's so popular and so legendary and so iconic is because it was right there in the middle of all these consoles, so everyone associates it with that sound. But just association doesn't really mean that you can't get that sound without it. And so the general technique is the thing that you should really be aware of to get that kind of sound. The low ratio, low threshold, with a fairly moderate to long attack and a fairly short to moderate release. And that's really the sound that people are using. People aren't really going for like the hardest setting with just a bit of threshold and like a really fast attack and a really long release. That's not the sound. If you dialed that in, it wouldn't sound like what people are doing with the SSL bus compressor. So that's a pretty common setup on the SSL bus compressor, but you can do the same thing on pretty much any compressor. Just load up curvature, hit the log algorithm and put in 30 milliseconds attack, 100 milliseconds release. You can put a fairly low ratio and then turn down the threshold until you're starting to see some activity on the meters. You can experiment with dialing in a bit of knee, because although the SSL bus compressor doesn't have any explicit knee control, it does have a bit of a soft knee in the way that it works. There's other compressors which are also quite popular as bus compressors, from API, from Noob, from Drama, from a fair few manufacturers have made units that have also been awarded the legendary marketing blurb in the remake plugins and stuff. And all of these compressors kind of offer a similar kind of sound. They aren't too fast in the attack. They're not too long or short in the release. They may or may not offer a soft kind of knee. And so this is a sound which a lot of people have really looked for the bus compression. So there's actually quite a few compressors that have been used throughout the history of the recording industry to get that kind of glue mix bus type sound, and it's actually fairly easy to set up, it's fairly easy to dial in, and there's many hardware units that can offer that sound, but you can just do all of that kind of sound with a plugin if you know the right kind of settings. You don't need to fall for the legendary magical marketing hype stuff and be sucked into getting a specific plugin for this type of glue and a specific other plugin for that specific other type of glue. You can just learn how to make that sound and do that on the same plugin, and it's fine. Next up, a lot of people may have heard of the terms feedback or feedforward when applied to compression, but perhaps, although the terms are popular, not a lot of people have a solid understanding of what that actually means. Let's look at the more modern feedforward approach. So the input signal comes in and then it's split off into another path, and this path calculates the slewed voltage, and then another path here goes to the VCA, and the slewed voltage is used to control the level of that VCA, and then that is the output signal after the VCA. So it's pretty simple. Signal splits, slew is calculated and used for the VCA, and then the signal output. So the only thing in the signal path is the VCA. And of course, the slewed signal is calculated using attack and release times and stuff like that. Now, the feedback way of doing things is slightly different. So the input signal comes in and it goes to whatever amplification is being used. Maybe it's a tube or something. And that's the main thing in the circuit, and it goes out. But we need to calculate the slew voltage, and the way that we do that is to split at the output and then calculate the slew signal and use that to amplify the signal. The reason why this is handy is because we can amplify, we can use the tube or whatever it is that's doing the amplification and controlling the gain. We can use that to amplify the signal that we're using to calculate the slewed voltage. Now, this was used in a bunch of old school vacuum tube compressor designs, and it's got a couple of reasons why this design was chosen. Firstly, you only need to have one amplifier stage because you're kind of piggybacking the amplification for the slewed voltage calculation off of the main amplification that's happening in the compressor anyway. So you only really need one vacuum tube, and the associated circuitry around that vacuum tube only needs to be done once. So it's cheaper from a components point of view, and it's easier to manufacture from a manufacturing point of view just to have one vacuum tube instead of multiple vacuum tubes. But that's not necessarily the only reason. Perhaps even a more important reason is the fact that when you have this design and you take the output voltage and use that to control the gain reduction, it becomes a bit more program dependent and it becomes a bit more smooth. So the difference between the two sound characters here, feedback is way smoother and generally has less aggressive amounts of gain reduction, whereas feed forward is kind of more modern, responds in a more direct and aggressive way. It's less smooth and you often get more gain reduction. So just on curvature, if you flick between the two modes, you might get a moderate amount of gain reduction with the feedback circuit, but then you flick to feed forward and you get double the amount of gain reduction or some significant amount more gain reduction happening, and it's happening in a way more obvious, in your face kind of way than with feedback. So that's why feedback is a really nice kind of way of doing this, because it does sound more smooth, gentle, more kind of, it's less in your face, but sometimes you want more in your face compression, and I often do. For many stuff that you want an obvious compression sound, well, feed forward is the way to go. But if you want more of that kind of like more program dependent kind of gluey sound, then the feedback is the way to go. So it's not really one is better than the other. It's like, what are you going for? And so they're both very interesting choices, but you have to choose the right one for what you want to do. What is it that you want? Do you want a smoother sound? Or do you want a more in your face, more direct kind of sound from the compression? Now, an interesting note about curvature is that when you select FB, the feedback mode, you get this going on, but you also get something else going on, which is you have a pot. Imagine this is a knob, the feedback knob, and that goes like this. So not only is the output used to determine the slew signal and the gain reduction of the compressor, it's also split off to the feedback knob, and when that is a non-zero value, it will send the output signal back into the input. And so it really is feedback. So you can make it squirrel, you can make it have runaway feedback here, self-oscillating feedback, if the feedback knob is on 100%, and especially if you increase the output gain, because the output gain knob is here. So if the output gain knob is turned up, it's going to increase the amount of gain going back in this system to get more gain reduction and more feedback if the feedback is up. So you can really cause self-oscillation if you put the output gain more than its 12 o'clock position. So this is not something you typically see on a vintage compressor, but it's a feature which I added in the original version because I thought it was cool, and you can get really interesting results using this feedback system. When processing a stereo signal with a stereo compressor, what happens if there's a loud sound only on the left side and not on the right? Well, if the channels are processed like two independent channels, the left channel will be ducked down with the loud sound, and the right channel will remain constant how it was, unaffected. And you might think, well, that's correct, because if the loud sound is on the left, I want it to be ducked down on the left. Nothing to do with the right, because the loud sound wasn't on the right, it was on the left. And you might think that makes sense, but generally speaking, you do indeed want the left channel to duck down the right as well. You want it to duck down both channels. So wherever there is a loud sound, that loud sound should duck down both channels, even if it's only on one side. Why is that? Well, imagine if there's a vocal in mono down the center, and let's say you've got a tom fill or something, floor tom, that is really loud on one side, and then just that side is ducked down. Well, because the vocal is mono in the center, or if you duck down one of the channels, it's going to unbalance the vocal. So ducking down one channel is going to kind of functionally pan the vocal to the other side, and it's going to sound louder in the other side. So it's almost like you're panning it off to the side while there is that loud sound. So what you'll do in that case is you'll unbalance the stereo image in the elements that are in the center or close to the center. You'll notice that those elements will kind of be panned off to one side, or they'll lose their force on the other side, and it will kind of not be the best sound. If you want a coherent vocal down the center, then unbalancing it isn't really normally what you want to do. Maybe you do want to do that, but most of the time you don't want to do that. So that's why when you compress a stereo signal, it's important to understand what you want to do with the stereo linking. Do you want it completely unlinked, so that, let's say you've got a synth sound and it pans around and does all sorts of weird stuff, and sometimes there's loud notes on one side? Well, that's fine. Maybe you can have that completely unlinked because it's just one sound and it's panning around and doing weird stuff anyway. It's kind of weird experimental sound, let's say, for example. But if you're doing the whole mix and you've got a vocal down the center, and then you've got some loud drum fill that maybe the floor tom, like I said, triggers the compressor on one of the sides, well, you'll probably want the stereo linking to be almost 100%, or at least like 90, at least 80%. Otherwise, it might throw the center of the vocal, the center of the stereo image off a bit. So that's another thing to bear in mind when using compressor in stereo. So most of the time, you should default to 100%, both channels linked, 100% stereo link, but only turn that down when there is a specific reason to do that. Let's look at some more compression techniques. So some of these are lesser known, perhaps even considered exotic. I've not really heard some of these discussed at all. And the first one I want to mention, I use this in my own music quite a lot when I'm making electronic music especially. And that's sidechaining something from an otherwise muted audio track to impart some kind of rhythm or interest in a track without actually revealing the source in the mix. So typically you'll be familiar with something like sidechain compression, where you've got the kick ducking down the rest of the mix. It's a very almost cliche sound at this point. Or you can use that same technique even in rock music, in many genres of music, to duck down the bass guitar from the kick. So the bass guitar gets knocked out of the way and they don't have to fight so much in the mix because you let the kick dominate over the bass guitar. That's fair because the bass guitar is generally longer and the kick's generally shorter. So in the short period that the kick is playing, the bass guitar can happily move out the way or be ducked down slightly in level. So that's the standard kind of stuff that most people are already familiar with, or at least I've already mentioned it in this course in the easier sections. But now, imagine a source, not the kick drum or something that you're actually hearing in the mix. It could literally just be a synthesizer that you're triggering on a key, or you're writing some kind of melody in a piano roll, or maybe even you've just got like a snare drum or some kind of drum, and you just record in manually, you are hitting this drum in a particular unusual rhythm, or some kind of rhythm that goes with the song. But this thing, it doesn't matter what it is. I could just use this and just record that in it. It really doesn't matter what it is, because you're not going to play that in the mix. This is going to be something which is there, recorded on a track, but muted in the mix. In other words, it's floated. Like you're not actually hearing that, but you'll send that on an auxiliary, or however you set that up in your DAW, to the sidechain input of the compressor on a sound which you are actually hearing in the mix. So, for example, I could have the vocal, anything, the vocal, the guitars, synthesizers. It works really well with prominent parts that are really prominent in the mix, especially like synthesizer pads, really bright, big, fat, wide synthesizer pads that are behind, maybe in a pop song or behind the vocal, and there's a really big full mix. Well, when you're just like playing that chord with the pad, or you got the guitars or something, it's just like playing, blasting out the chords, that might sound really good, but it might not be rhythmically that complex or interesting. Maybe it's good, maybe it works, maybe it's great, but there could be a little more something. It could have a little more interest, a little bit more rhythm in there that isn't currently in there. Well, if I just start, or whatever rhythm, and then record that in, just essentially a scratch track of something, and loop it, and if it's not BPM synced, I can just record for the whole thing, just hitting literally anything. It really doesn't matter. Then use that as the sidechain source. You'll be amazed how interesting that can really make stuff. And obviously you can set that up on the compressor to be however fast or however severe in terms of the gain reduction as you want. You can really, if it's an electronic track especially, you can completely design the rhythm of a part that way. So you can just literally just play like duh, duh, some boring thing, right? And then now you've got dun 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 dun, or whatever the thing. Like you can make really interesting stuff that way. And I've done that so many times before. And when you mute that floated track, the whole thing just sounds rubbish in comparison sometimes. If you're really using it as a creative effect, it can really sound rubbish if you mute that. And then when you put it back in, it makes the whole song. That can be such a powerful thing. It can make an entire song. So that's definitely an advanced or a more advanced technique, which a lot of people don't consider. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about that one so much, but that one is extremely powerful, and that's definitely made some of the tracks that I have produced. So I've got a bit of a boring sounding pad sound. Doesn't really do all that much, but what I can do is record in some clapping or anything. It could be banging on the table, clapping my hands, whatever. Doesn't really matter all that much. So I'm just going to go ahead and record some random kind of clapping now. Now we've got that clapping. In Reaper, I can click this box here to remove it from the master bus. So when we play this now, we won't hear that. There's clapping happening. We can see that here on the meters. There's clapping happening, but we are not hearing that in the mix. But what we can do is we can route that to this track on channels 3 and 4, and if you use Logic or something else, it's going to be slightly different exactly how you set this up. But I'm just going to load up curvature, go up to the sidechain page, external sidechain source, and that is going to be drawing from channels 3 and 4, like I just set up. So now, when we play, we will hear there you go. If we get the gain right going in there, we'll start hearing that clapping effect affecting that pad, despite the fact we're not actually hearing that in the mix. And maybe there's some part of this clapping sound which you like the sound of, so you can, for example, loop that particular section. Let's say you like that, well, you could get rid of the rest of it, commit that down, for example, and then just pull it out. And now you've got a cool sounding loop, if that sounds cool. I don't know, it's kind of just a bit random what I just did, but so another technique, which I've been doing for years and years and years, but I don't see that many people talking about, or if you've looked at my EQ enlightenment course or my kick drum course, you already know about it, but that's the pre-post emphasis sandwich technique. And this is, you have a pre-emphasis EQ, you have something in the middle of the sandwich, and then you have a post-emphasis EQ. So you have something sandwiched between two EQs. The pre-emphasis is you're doing something dramatic with the EQ, and then the post-emphasis is you're undoing whatever dramatic thing that you did in the first EQ. And then so what is in between depends on what you're going for, but in this course we're talking about dynamics, so you'd have a compressor in there. Otherwise you could have a distortion in there, or you could have some other thing in there, but generally speaking, is the most common things you will do this with are going to be distortion and compression. So I've got a drum recording here, and we can put a compressor on it and press play and see what happens. It compresses it in a pretty normal way. Not that much gain reduction is happening right now, but we can load an EQ. So let's get up Pro Q2, and now if we boost up the bass frequencies some absurd amount, let's say at 150, we're boosting up by 30 dB, which is quite a lot. And we make sure that the EQ comes first and then curvature, and then we copy and paste the EQ, open up the second one, and so much it's gone off the screen. We grab that and we invert it. So we say, instead of it being plus 30, it's now minus 30. So we've now done the opposite. So we've done a crazy EQ, and then we've counteracted that crazy EQ here. And let's see what happens with the sound now. And before. You should be able to hear that when the kick drum is playing, the compression is working way harder with the EQs engaged. You can on curvature, you don't really need to do that. You could have the same or similar effect by just activating the sidechain EQ. Because there's sidechain EQ built in, we can pump up the bass just in the detector circuit, or pump up the high frequencies just in the detector circuit, so we don't need to do this sandwich thing. But let's say we don't have that option. We have another compressor, let's say Recomp, for example. Now Recomp is cool because it's got high pass and low pass filter here. But let's say we wanted just to boost up the bass a whole bunch. We can't do that with recomp. And let's say, I don't know, you've got the toucan compressor. So we've got a cool compressor here from Toucan Studios, but as you can see, there isn't any EQ here in the sidechain in the detector circuit. So if you wanted to use this compressor, for example, you could put it in the middle and get rid of curvature for a second and recomp. You could have EQ, Toucan compressor, and then another EQ. You can do any frequency. It doesn't have to, it could just be a massive bell booster. Generally speaking, if you do something massive, then it's going to have the greatest impact that you're going to be able to hear more obviously. Versus has a profound effect. And I'm not saying that you necessarily want this specific thing that I'm doing here. You might not want to emphasize the mid frequencies in a drum recording. I'm just showing you the effect in general, because if there is a compressor which you want to use, but it lacks the functionality to EQ the sidechain channels, then you can do it that way. So although that first way of doing it works just fine, there's another way of doing it which is a bit cleaner, a bit more professional. The first way is really intuitive and you don't have to do anything with complex routing. But here I'm going to show you a bit more of a pro, a bit more of a better way to do that, but you need to be a bit more clever with the routing structure. So let's get our compressor, which let's say we think this one is cool, we want to use this, but we want to EQ the sidechain and there's not really an option for that. It does have a sidechain input, so we can send an external sidechain source, but it doesn't have really any real big way to EQ the sidechain. So what we can do is we can get some other plugins, re-EQ. We can get a re-EQ here, but we can just use this as a dummy plugin and not do anything, and route out of it a duplicate stereo out to channels 3 and 4, and then put that first. So now what's happening is it's routing a duplicate signal of this across, so it's got 1 and 2, and then a duplicate on 3 and 4. And where we've got the sidechain now engaged, it's going to be doing the same thing with that button in or out because we're just sending it a duplicate. That should make sense, that we're not doing anything new because we're just duplicating the signal. So without the button in, the sidechain detector circuit is just the input signal. And with that in, the sidechain detector circuit is also the input signal because it's just a duplicated version of it. So we actually would have to change the sidechain path on 3 and 4 in order to actually affect it in some way. So what we can do is we can get another re-EQ, put that in between here, and say we just want to affect, we don't want to affect one or two or anything, we just want to affect 3 and 4. So we can put in here pins 3 and 4, and we're only affecting the duplicate signal that we've sent out, because the input 3 and 4, the output 3 and 4. So now we can do some crazy stuff with this EQ, and it's not going to EQ the sound of the actual signal itself, it's just going to EQ the sidechain. So this is pretty cool. So we can listen to how that sounds when I sweep it about now. So we get different kinds of sounds depending on where we're going to EQ it. The compressor is working in radically different ways depending on how we EQ it. And again, you have to be doing some pretty heavy-handed moves for it to influence the characteristics of the compressor in a significant way. And so that's what I'd recommend. Don't just be like, oh yeah, I'm going to do 1 dB or something. really go for it and see how it changes the sound of the compressor. And then obviously after you've done that, you can then further tweak the compressor. But that's one way how to do it. But not everyone has the ability to kind of like bunny hop signal chain stuff in the track itself. That's more of a Reaper exclusive feature. Some other DAWs do that, but most DAWs aren't as advanced as that in their routing capabilities. So I'm going to show you a bit more of a universal DAW friendly way how to do that now. So to depict this, I could use less tracks, but I'm just going to make it really easy by busing that here, busing that there, and then floating this track here. And now, when I play that, we're going to have this coming through on both of those tracks. So it's just this track duplicated on these two tracks. Now we can put our Toucan compressor. We can get our Toucan Studios compressor again. And so now this is compressing that signal there. But we want to get the sidechain activated, and we want to EQ the sidechain. So now we can put an EQ here. So EQ, it doesn't matter the EQ, just any EQ. We're loading it up. We're not doing anything fancy internally with these with the patch bay, the internal channel patch bay or anything. What we can do now is, because we're going to EQ this one, we don't want to hear this one, so we float this one as well. Take it off the master bus send, and we can then route this back to this one on channels 3 and 4, or the auxiliary sidechain input, however you route that in Logic, it might be slightly different. And now what we're doing is we're routing audio to here, we're routing to here, but we're not hearing there, we're not hearing there, we're only hearing here, and this is then routing back to that with the EQ on it into the channels 3 and 4, the sidechain input here. So it should now achieve the same effect. And as you can hear, it had the same kind of, well, the identical effect, because it's essentially exactly the same thing, but we're just doing it in a way which people might be a bit more familiar with. So, and then we can label that side chain EQ or something, and label this comp, and label this original, if that helps. But yeah, pretty simple stuff. But that's super handy, and a lot of people don't know that you can do that trick to EQ the sidechain channel if you want to influence the sound of compressor. Super, super handy if you've got a compressor plugin that you want to use, but it's not sufficiently advanced to actually do any of this stuff. Curvature is sufficiently advanced to do that kind of stuff. If you want to EQ the sidechain, you just go over to the sidechain page, you click chain, and then you select the one of the EQ shapes that you want to use. It's that easy. And if you want to EQ the sound of the actual signal itself, you can click main, and you can do both at the same time. You can just EQ the main. It's super handy because it's essentially just a free quick EQ baked into your compressor plugin. It's really handy. I use that a lot for mixing. So the next technique I want to discuss is the pseudo gate, and I am calling it the pseudo gate. It is gating, but it's not really the thing that you're going to use as your primary gating method, but it's cool to know anyway. We already saw it when we looked at VCV rack and built our own compressor out of Eurorack modules. And before we inverted the gain going to the VCA, we got a gating sound instead of the compression sound. Now we can just do the exact same thing with a plugin. So let's use curvature to get a bit of compression happening, and then it's extremely easy to do. You might be shocked at how easy it is to do in Reaper, and we turn it into a gate. Boom. So we just alt click on the wet and dry knob. So every plugin in Reaper has a wet and dry knob, and you just alt click the wet and dry knob, and then you hear the delta. What is happening here? Well, it's easier to explain perhaps if I create a couple of tracks. So if I were to get this track and duplicate it, I don't need to necessarily copy the audio file. I could just do that, but for now, just to demonstrate it, let's bypass curvature for a second. So now if we play it, we're going to hear it doubled. But as most people, or at least should know, if you flip the polarity of one of them, it's going to cancel out. I'm playing both of them, we're seeing signal there, but we're not getting anything on the master fader because they're cancelling out. If I solo one of them, and it doesn't matter which one you solo, you're gonna hear it. And if I change the gain, you're gonna hear it. But if they're exactly volume matched and you've hit the polarity flip button, well, they're gonna cancel out one to one, because it's like, what is 1 plus -1? Well, it's 0. It cancels out. So that's what we're getting here. But if we introduce a change in one of them by adding compression, we're going to start hearing that which is not the same. So any difference at all, like if I change the level like I've just showed you, you're going to start hearing it. So any difference we introduce in one of them is going to be audible, and that's the only thing that we're going to be hearing. So we're just going to be hearing what we are compressing. So we're listening to just what curvature is doing to the sound. We're only hearing what it's doing to the sound, and we're not hearing the actual track itself because it's been cancelled out. So we're only hearing that, and that is called the delta, the difference between two signals. And it's acting as a gate. And you can use this to gate drums, you can gate toms, you can gate the snare, you can do whatever you want. I don't generally tend to gate my drums that heavily, to be honest, but you can use that as a functional gate. It's not going to beat a dedicated gate plugin, but you can at least get the same effect. At the start of the course, I played this demo beat that I made. And all this is a bunch of sine waves here. Nothing else, just sine waves as sources. And everything you're hearing is a result of the automation I'm doing with the instances of curvature. So if I press play, we don't need to necessarily listen to it, but we can just see that the automation here is going pretty mad. And we can automate anything. So we can just add another lane. What do we want to do? Do we want to do the release time, the attack time? We can automate pretty much anything. Like you can even automate oversampling on and off and stuff like that. Like I really opened up this compressor to automation. So pretty much every single parameter that is actually movable on the interface, and even a few things that aren't even movable on the interface, is exposed as available automation settings. And whether you're using curvature or another compressor, it doesn't really matter. The same concept applies. And I don't really need to show you how I drew this in. There's no special magic involved. I just drew in some automation. You can do the same too. Most DAWs allow you to either click on a specific point and drag that and change the shape of that, or you can get the a tool like that and draw it in. Some of this I drew like that. Some of it I did more manually. And let's load up, for example, recomp, just a really standard stock plugin. What can we automate on recomp? We've still got a nice amount of stuff that we can automate here as well. I don't know what some of this is. What is res VD? I don't know. You can try it out and get all kinds of different interesting sounds that you can't get if you just leave it alone. And yeah, sure, this is going to be more of a sound design stuff. Maybe if you're making electronic music or if you're making beats or something, then this is going to be something which is going to be more suitable than if you're just mixing classic rock tracks or something. But even if you're doing stuff which doesn't necessarily call for sound design, you can still get some interesting results out of automating certain things, especially if you want to emphasize the chorus or bring stuff down in the verse or do whatever kind of dynamic changes you want to do. Or you don't only have kind of like volume automation at your disposal. You do have volume automation at your disposal, and that's very important, but you have many different types of automation that you can use, so why not use it? And you can get some really interesting results that way, especially with electronic music. Earlier I mentioned that some people search for a particular compressor which suits the sound, rather than just knowing how to use a full-featured compressor properly. And that raises the question, what is the difference then between the different topologies such as VCA, Opto, FET, all these different types of compressors? And the answer has two parts. So one part is that they have different time constants and curves, and we can just use my Delta Expose plugin to analyze those curves and time constants. And the conclusion that you'll quickly come to is that FET compressors have extremely short time constants, and you can't really make them all that much longer. VCA compressors have fairly fast time constants, and you can't really make them much shorter or much longer. And Opto compressors often have slightly longer time constants, and they sometimes have dual envelopes, but at the end of the day, the different topologies, at least in plugin form, are dominated by their arbitrarily constrained time constants. But in the ranges in which their time constants overlap, you can often get one type of compressor to sound the same or almost the same as a completely different type of compressor, which you'd think would be totally different in character. And that's because compressors are all essentially doing the same thing. They're doing gain reduction, and you've just got a few different curves and ranges of time constants in how you can dial in that sound. But if you can get them to match very closely, they'll sound very closely to one another. And the reason for this narrow range of time constants that you're forced into is because obviously it comes from the original hardware. That's a relic from the design limitations of the analog gear. And the reason why an LA2A, for example, is called an opto compressor is because it works based on light. The active part is essentially an LED strapped to a photoresistor, and the vintage models use electroluminescent panels, but they didn't use LEDs, but the modern ones do. But the concept either way is the same, and the combination of some kind of light source and a photoresistor is often called a Vactrol, because that was one of the companies who made it back in the day. And a whole bunch of companies use them for different things, like Buchla synthesizers used those Vactrols for their low-pass gates, and Make Noise still makes low-pass gates based on Vactrols. There was recently a concern over cadmium, which is a toxic heavy metal which was used to make the Vactrols back in the day. But the way that it works is, when the LED lights up, the photoresistor changes resistance and lets more current flow, but the photoresistor is slow compared to a transistor. So even if you wanted to have a really fast attack time on an opto compressor, you can't, because the actual core bit of kit that's making this thing work is just slow. And that's why it gives the sound that it does, because it has a slower kind of response time, and it responds in a way which is kind of characteristic of the optical technique that it uses. So that's why it's called an opto compressor. It also has valves in it as well, and so you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between a valve or a tube compressor and an opto compressor if an opto compressor has tubes as well? Well, a lot of things can cross over sometimes, but generally speaking, you can't make an LA2A be super fast because of the slowness of the opto cell. But tubes can go faster than Vactrols, but they're slowed down a bit as well by the inertia effect because of the way that tube circuits are classically designed. But VCAs don't really have that limitation, so they're even faster than tubes. And their VCAs are way faster than Vactrols, but transistors are even faster than all of those other technologies. So that's why the 1176 compressor, for example, which uses a FET, is extremely fast. It's faster than pretty much any other compressor. It's got microsecond attack times. There's also diode bridge designs like the TG1 compressor. I used to have one of those. They sound really good as well. And also pulse width modulation type compressors, which are a bit more rare and exotic. And those two designs can both go very fast, so the time constants that are set by the manufacturer is essentially just an arbitrary choice based upon the subjective musicality and the design goals that the manufacturer had. So historically, there's been a bunch of different technologies used to make compressors. Some of them were quicker or slower than others, and it was pretty much like opto is the slowest, and then tubes and then VCAs, and then transistors and diode bridge and pulse width modulation, all pretty quick. So there's kind of like a ranking of how quick they can actually respond in a musical way. And so that really determined their time constant, because if you can't go faster than the technology allows, then it's a slower kind of compressor, and that's what you got. Or if it could go super fast, like an 1176, then maybe that was a really good selling point of the compressor. So you want to play towards that kind of sound rather than allowing the user to have a broader range of sounds, because you want to niche down on that particular thing. But nowadays, with digital technology, the restraints imposed are completely unnecessary. There's no reason to have an arbitrarily smaller range of time constants when you just can have a wider range. Like, why do you need to limit the user? So it's just a relic from the past, which a lot of plugin manufacturers bring over to their modern age because they're trying to recreate stuff, right? But if you want a full-featured compressor plugin, why can't you just do what you want to do? And if the plugin developer doesn't arbitrarily restrict the range of time constants available to you, well, then you can do whatever sound that you want, because you can go slower or faster or in between. You can do whatever time constants you want, providing you also have good control over the curvature of the attack and release curves. Then you can make pretty much any classic sound, whether you want an opto sound, you want a fast sound like a 1176, or whatever you want, a VCA sound like a SSL bus compressor. Well, you just dial it in, and there you go. You got the sound if you know how to do that, which is why I always recommend learning how to use one piece of gear properly rather than buying lots of gear that you don't know how to use. And the ultimate case of that idiocy is obviously the fools who have 10 terabytes of pirated software and plugins, and they don't know how to use any of it. Part 2 of this question is that different compressors have different distortion characteristics. VCA compressors are often cleaner, and FET compressors often dirtier in their distortion characteristics. But ultimately, if you want distortion, wouldn't it be better just to apply the distortion that you want intentionally, rather than just be merely subjected to distortion bundled as part of your compression without the ability to change it? But you might be thinking, okay, well, if there's different sounding distortion characteristics on different compressors, then maybe it is worthwhile having 20 different compressors and then trying out a whole bunch of them and seeing what one works best on this track or maybe that sound. And I don't really know, I need to pick from all of my various compressors to find out, and it's trial and error. I'm not a fan of this approach. It's much better, in my opinion, just to have one go-to compressor which is full featured, that you know how to use, and you can get whatever sound you want. If you want a fast compression sound like an 1176, you know how to dial in the attack and release times to get a fast sound. If you want more of a mix bus kind of sound, we can dial in that sound to sound more like an SSL bus compressor, having more moderate attack and release times. And if you want something that's a really aggressive mid-90s hard rock kind of snare sound, then you know that maybe you can choose an attack time, something like 20 milliseconds, and a release time like 100 milliseconds, 120 milliseconds, with a high ratio and a lot of gain reduction. And this kind of stuff, like if you know what you're looking for and you know how to get there, just using one compressor plugin that you're familiar with, which is full featured enough to allow you to achieve the sounds that you want to achieve, is way quicker. It takes merely seconds, rather than 15, 20, 30 minutes sitting there with 20 different compressor plugins, trying out this one, trying out that one, don't know if I like that, this one, maybe that one will work. And in my opinion, it's just so much better just to know what you're doing. Now, there is one specific circumstance in which having multiple compressors on the same sound actually does make sense. And that's if you have two compressors and they're both doing different attack and release times. And this is because some compressors, hardware compressors as well, have dual stage envelopes. So what they're doing is they have a fast attack time, which is applying some amount of gain reduction, and then a slower attack time, which is applying additional gain reduction. And the two together create more of a complex curve. And this isn't exactly something that you can always do just with one compressor on its own. And so putting two compressors in series, one after the other, replicates this very nicely. And this is the dual stage approach, which can actually give interesting results. One thing that some people are confused about is the need for oversampling in compression. If a compressor is just adjusting gain over time, why do you need oversampling? Do you need oversampling then if you adjust the level of your fader in the DAW? Not really, but then why would you need it for a compressor? Well, the reason is because compressors adjust gain very quickly, and they can do it so quickly that it causes harmonic distortion. And if there is additional harmonic distortion as part of the design or part of the character of that compressor, for example, it just is a distortion unit in addition to being a compressor, then you're definitely going to be causing a fair amount of harmonic distortion. And even without overt distortion, you're still going to have harmonic distortion generated from the nature of the compressor itself if the attack and release times are sufficiently short. So anytime you create harmonic distortion, you are creating problems in the digital domain if you don't oversample or somehow counteract that. So the short answer is yes, you should be using oversampling if your computer is fast enough to support that, and most computers nowadays are, unless you're going mad with the amount of instances that you have and you're maxing out your CPU. But generally speaking, 4x or 8x, they're the best kind of oversampling factors to go for, because 2x doesn't really do that much. It's not actually all that effective. 2x, it does a bit, but it's kind of not worth it. But once you start going over 8x, it starts to get diminishing returns. So some people say you need 32x or 64x even, and some plugins offer that. But in my tests, I think 8x, after that, you're starting to get diminishing returns there. So that's why, for example, curvature, if you want oversampling, it's just fixed 4x, because I find that the sweet spot in terms of CPU consumption and the actual audible result. So let's just assume you're happy with 4x. You might think, but why do I actually really need oversampling? You said you should use oversampling. A lot of people have told me that I should use oversampling because it won't sound good if it causes harmonic distortion, and that's kind of a problem. But why? What is the actual reason? Why is there a problem from harmonic distortion in the digital domain? Well, in order to explain why we need oversampling, I'll first just explain what oversampling is, because many people have heard of it, or they use it, and they click that button for the oversampling, and they know that it's good, but it's just some magical process, and they don't really understand what is happening. It's not actually that difficult to explain or to conceptualize what is happening there, so I'll take the opportunity to do that now. So in digital audio, most people know that digital audio consists of a bunch of samples in a row. You've got one sample after the other at 44.1 thousand per second or 96,000 per second, depending on your sample rate. Now imagine what oversampling is doing is it's just putting a sample in between every single sample. It's just padding a zero. It's just putting a zero in there. So you've got one sample, zero. Another sample, zero. Another sample, zero. Another sample, zero. Another sample, zero. It's just putting a zero in between each one of your samples. And that would just be 2x oversampling. 4x oversampling, it will be putting 3 zeros in between all of your samples. So sample 000, sample 000, sample 000. And you think, well, wouldn't that just cause distortion and sound weird if you just randomly pad it with zeros? No, this is called zero stuffing. And then what you do is you low pass filter it, and the low pass filter kind of balances out all of these zeros you've just stuffed into the audio. So you stuff your waveform full of zeros, low pass filter it. What was the point of that? Well, now, because we stuffed 3 zeros after each sample, we've now got 4 samples instead of 1 sample. So we've just 4x'd the amount of samples. So we've just upsampled. So once we've low pass filtered that, we're now at a higher sampling rate. So now it's shifted the Nyquist frequency significantly higher. So the Nyquist frequency is half the sampling rate. So at 44.1, the Nyquist frequency is about 22. So the problem is anything that goes above the Nyquist frequency gets mirrored back into the audible range. This is because sounds above the Nyquist frequency are mathematically ambiguous because they have to be represented with less than 2 samples. So if you think about a sine wave, it goes higher and it goes low. Well, you can represent that with 2 samples, the higher bit and the low bit. If you're lucky, you'll get that represented quite well with 2 samples. But if it's higher than that, now you can't represent it only with 2 samples because you've kind of run out of resolution. It's like looking at a really pixelated image. So there's a limit to what you can represent, and the limit is the Nyquist frequency. And if you go higher than that, then you're not going to be able to represent the audio because you've just run out of data points. And so it becomes mathematically ambiguous what it's actually supposed to be. So the effect of this is that the frequencies get mirrored back into the audible range. So the higher it goes outside of the audible range, so the higher it exceeds the Nyquist frequency, so half the sample rate, the lower it gets mirrored back in. That sounds bad. Like in the worst case, you'll hear kind of birds chirping kind of noises, like low quality MP3 compression or something like that. So you don't want that. So what do? Well, you have to low pass filter the sound to get rid of those harmonics so they can't go above Nyquist. But the problem is, if you low pass filter, like if you do something at 44.1, for example, and you generate a whole bunch of harmonics above the Nyquist frequency, you can't then subsequently low pass filter them out because you've already created the aliasing. The aliasing happens at the point in which the harmonics were created. You can't, it's not like the frequencies are stored and then in the next step you can get rid of them. When they're created, in the same step, you get that aliasing mirroring back into the audible range. So you're already screwed. So you have to prevent the aliasing before it happens. So the way that you do that is oversample. So you've upsampled to a much higher sampling rate and you have a much wider frequency range that you can represent before aliasing occurs. You do your processing at that higher sample rate and you can accurately record those harmonics up to a frequency of say 100 kilohertz, at which you would start to get aliasing if it went above that. But 100k, that's already so high that you're not really going to get that much going on at 100. And then if you do get stuff even exceeding 100, well then it has to mirror back. So not only do you have to go all the way up to 100, well you have to go all the way much higher than that for it to come back down to get to below 20k. So you have to go really high up. So then what you do, once you've recorded it at the higher sample rate, you just low pass filter it and decimate it back down to 44.1 or whatever your original sampling rate was, and there you go. That's what oversampling is, and that's why you need it, because you get rid of that mathematical ambiguity which causes the weird bird chirping noises in the high frequencies if you do that. Now, oversampling is great, but there's a bit of a problem with it, and that's the CPU usage. It's very intensive because you're multiplying everything that you're doing with the DSP by the oversampling factor. So if you've got 4x oversampling, well, instead of just doing the amount of processing you need for the compressor once, you're doing it the equivalent of 4 times. And so that is way more processing. It's not quite as much as that because there's some things which aren't scaled in a linear way, but it's a big CPU hit. If you've got many plugins in your session and they're all oversampled, well, that's going to start taxing your CPU pretty quickly. Nowadays, computers are kind of fast enough to deal with it, so it's becoming less of an issue. But 10 years ago, it was much more of a big issue, and people were trying to find alternatives to oversampling. In 2015, you had Apple's MacBook Pro 15-inch come out, and that was an amazing laptop. I used that laptop for years. I've still got one, and it was really ahead of its time. A fantastic computer back then. But using it now and comparing that to the M4 Mac that I use now, there's no comparison. It can do way more plugins in a session. Now people are using 64x oversampling and all this kind of stuff, and you can do it with a few plugins, but if you're using 4x oversampling, you can have way more instances than you could have just 10 years ago. So now it's less of a problem, but people have been busy looking at other solutions instead of oversampling, doing other kind of stuff. And one thing that people were looking at was the antiderivative anti-aliasing. And this is interesting for saturation effects, distortion effects, stuff like that. It's less interesting for compression because compression is a bit too complicated. You can't really do that mathematics, and the mathematics would get so complicated that it might actually be easier just to oversample it, or it definitely would be from a programming perspective, just to oversample it, than to do all of the math in order to calculate what the antiderivatives would be of the compression curves and stuff that. But the thing is, if it's pretty much limited to distortion, well, distortion effects aren't that CPU intensive. And I found when I was experimenting with some antiderivative anti-aliasing code, doing some saturation stuff, real extreme stuff, when you push it really hard, it starts to break up and sound super bad. So the only kind of use I was getting out of that when I was experimenting with it was that you could do subtle saturation effects with reduced aliasing, but it was quite complicated to code that in a good way, and it didn't really give you that much benefit because it's not all that CPU hungry in the first place to do some kind of nonlinear transform. So it didn't really offer that much advantage as opposed to oversampling. And when you actually apply it to something a bit more CPU hungry, like a compressor or a more advanced process, you can't then use the antiderivative anti-aliasing because the mathematics is just too difficult. You can't even code it. Like, it's not even about computation. It's about you can't even figure out how to code this stuff. It just gets it's enormously difficult, borderline impossible. Some people might point out that 3-body technology managed to do antiderivative anti-aliasing in their compressor because they only use that to calculate the absolute values for the sidechain signal, and that's not the most significant cause of aliasing anyway, so their plugin actually just uses regular oversampling for the stuff that actually matters. One thing that people might be curious about is how comes FET compressors can sound more dirty, maybe even than tube compressors sometimes. Why have they got more grit? Shouldn't a transistor, because it's solid state, be cleaner, even sterile? Why is it so dirty in comparison to other types of compression amplification circuits? And that's an interesting question. Now, there's a bunch of different types of transistors that people can use for amplifiers, so I'm going to oversimplify this slightly because we don't really need the additional nuance. So I'll just say there's 2 types of transistors used in audio broadly. There's BJTs and there's FETs. So BJT stands for bipolar junction transistor and FET stands for field effect transistor. But within each of these 2 groups, there's another 2 groups. So BJTs have NPN and PNP transistors, and FETs can be broken down into JFET and MOSFET. Now, many people know that the 1176 uses a FET variety transistor, but specifically it's a JFET, but it's not the only transistor in there, and it's not the only type of transistor which is used. It also uses BJT transistors. So when people say that an 1176 is a FET compressor, what they should probably say, if they wanted to be more specific, is that the gain reduction is applied with a JFET type transistor, and it also uses additional transistors for the input and output stages, and in those cases they're NPN BJTs. Now, the BJTs are clean, low noise, pretty linear, and they're not really contributing much to the sound, which is of course why most people focus on that JFET transistor. So if you watched earlier in the course, we made a rudimentary compressor using VCV rack, and the way that we did that, we took a VCA, which is a voltage controlled amplifier module, and we had our input signal and we had our output. And so we fed our input signal into the VCA, and then the output of the VCA is the output of the compressor. And that was the signal path, the actual what was in the signal path, just the VCA. Pretty simple. But obviously that doesn't do anything yet. So we needed to control the VCA with the control voltage, and we controlled it with our slewed signal that we created using the slew limiter module. And we fed the slew limiter module from the input signal to use the slew limiter. Then we generated the control voltage. We actually inverted it, so I could also do polarity sign here. We inverted that and adjusted the gain and stuff, and that's how we made our rudimentary compressor using a voltage controlled amplifier. Now that's pretty much the same thing as what you do with a JFET, but I can go into a bit more technical detail and actually draw what is happening on a kind of basic level inside the JFET. Now this is obviously not what is physically happening, this is just a depiction of the process. So instead of calling it input and output, we call it source, and the output we call drain when it comes to a transistor. And instead of saying control voltage input or something like that, or CV input that we'd be used to in a modular synth setup, we have the same thing, but it's called the gate. So that's what it looks like on the outside of the transistor, and that's why most transistors have 3 legs and there's 3 connections. And on the inside, obviously it doesn't physically look like this necessarily on the inside, but this is just a depiction. You kind of have 2 things on the side here, and this has this is P material, P-type material. And then in the middle, you have N-type material. This is all N-type material. And the way that it works is, and because both sides have P-type material, we can make a connection from the gate on this side to that side. And this is pretty much what's going on. And you might be like, okay, but what does that do? Why have you got P and why have you got N type material? So the N channel provides a conductive pathway from the source to the drain, so current can flow across this transistor pretty much unimpeded. And if we were thinking about the signal path in an 1176, we could visualize something like you have the input stage here with a transistor buffering and amplifying the signal, and then it comes in, it goes through the source side to the drain side unimpeded, and then there's some kind of output transistor, and that goes to the output of the compressor where you can plug that back into your mixing console, whatever you're going to do, and then another bit forks off here and does some slew stuff, and that does some cool stuff and produces control voltage, and then that kind of controls the gate, something like this. So let's tidy this up a bit. So we've got the control voltage, the slew signal, slew voltage, controlling the gate here. So when that is 0, that's 0 volts, 0 dB gain reduction, then the current is flowing across this transistor unimpeded. But then if you make the gate voltage more negative and you don't increase it, generally with JFETs you'll decrease it so it goes negative. So some negative voltage is applied to the gate, and this has the effect that the P material starts to pinch off the channel here where the N material is. So the pathway for the current to flow starts to get slightly pinched off, and it kind of does something a bit like this. It kind of forms a bit of a blob biased into the direction of the drain. And so it kind of does something like that. And then if you apply even more negative voltage to the gate, it will start to pinch off even more. And this may not be the most beautiful drawing in the world, but this is hopefully a depiction which makes sense. So we start to get something like this. And then even more, it starts to almost pinch off entirely to the point where it will just completely shut it down. And at the maximum point, no current is going to flow through here because you've just pinched off the channel entirely, so no current will flow anymore. And that's the way that you control the amount of gain reduction. Now, the interesting thing here about the saturation and answering the original question of why an 1176 can sound dirty in the kind of compression it does, or the sound that it has in the unit, well, it has to do with the fact that this N material here, of course, is conductive and it allows current to flow from the source to the drain. When the gate is at 0 volts, it will allow a fair amount of current to flow, but it's not got an infinite capacity. It can only conduct so much. It can only allow so much current to flow through here before it can't allow any more to flow through, because there's just not enough conductive path, enough conductive material to allow the current to flow from the source to the drain. So there's some point at which it won't conduct any more current through here, and you'll start to saturate this. And what we can do, we can just visualize this on the chart. So let's make a quick chart. So this is the input voltage on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have output voltage. So let's say we have an input voltage this big. Well, the JFET can handle that, so it outputs the same voltage. And let's say we have a voltage this big on the input. Well, the JFET can handle that, so it outputs the same voltage. But let's say we have a voltage this big on the input. Well, the JFET sort of can't really handle that much anymore because it's starting to saturate. There's just not enough conductive material here to create a sufficiently large pathway for the current to flow from the drain to the source. So it just can't conduct that much current. So it starts to not be able to produce the same output voltage as the input voltage. And then we increase the output voltage again, and it just can't handle it. So it's kind of, what happens is we get this linear range, but then it kind of chokes off like this. And if we are to just represent that just with a line, it's something like this. And that's assuming, let's say that that here the gate is at 0 volts. We get this kind of curve. But then what happens if we make the gate voltage more negative? Well, then it's going to start doing this choking off kind of thing that we already discussed here. And then the channel here with the N material is going to be smaller, and it's going to be able to conduct less current through here. Less current is going to be able to flow. So whereas before an input voltage here would result in an output voltage there, well, what's happening now is we've made that channel smaller, and so it's not able to actually allow so much current to flow there. So maybe it will only result in an output voltage here. So what actually ends up happening is you've now got a curve something like this when we've made the channel smaller. So if we plot out a bunch of these lines, so I'm going to try and draw this a tiny bit more tidy. So we have something like this going on, let's just say. What ends up happening is you can spot that the region that is most linear is here, and this is called the ohmic region. And so you can see that the more gain reduction that is applied, the further left the ohmic region is shifted, meaning all of this here is non-linear. We can do that in red to show that this is all of the non-linear stuff here, distortion. And all of this, let's do it in green, all of this is clean. Well, pretty much clean. This is the linear range, and that is the non-linear distortion saturation range. And the more gain reduction happens, the further left that shifted, meaning the more saturation you get for the same input signal. So that's why a JFET compressor is going to cause this distortion, because the more gain reduction which is happening, the more saturation is happening. So in short, the harder the compressor works, the more distortion you get. So up until now, we've been talking about vintage compressors, classic compression sounds, how to recreate that, the attack and release times, how compressors work, tips and tricks, techniques, how to make interesting compression sounds in your mix. But all of this that I've talked so far has just been classic stuff. Even if we're doing more experimental stuff with those classic designs, everything that I've been discussing has been classic compression at its core. So whether that's a tube or FET or VCA or opto compressor, all of this is the classic way that compression works, which I have explained with diagrams during this course. But are there any novel types of compression or weird and wacky types of compression which are more exotic or new that people aren't really talking about? Well, I decided to create some myself. The first I released was my Black-Scholes algorithm, and in order to understand how that works, you need to understand what financial options are and how they're traded. Now, I personally trade options, and it's one of my income sources, and at some point I'm going to start a second channel dedicated to options trading. But for now, I would just like to preface what I'm about to say with a disclaimer that if you attempt to trade options without having first done the kind of legwork consistent with a master's degree in finance, you will get wrecked. You will lose your money very quickly and very efficiently. So with that out of the way, let's get started. What are options? What am I even talking about? So this is a bit too complex to do a full presentation on, and it's a tiny bit off topic, but I'm going to just explain what vanilla European calls are, because this is the type of option that I use inside Curvature to do the Black-Scholes compression algorithm. So if you want, you can go and buy 100 shares of Apple on the stock market right now, and it will cost you, for example, $100 per share. So for 100 shares, I need to spend 10 grand to enter that trade. And everyone knows that if I hold the shares for a year and then sell them, I lose money if the shares fall in value. I make a profit if they go up. Everyone knows that. If Apple rises to $120, then my shares are now worth $12,000. And if I sell them, I get back my initial investment of 10 grand plus an additional profit of $2,000. And if that really happened, that would be great. However, I have to tie up $10,000 for a whole year in that particular example. What if I could make a deal with someone? We write a contract, we agree that in 1 year, I get to buy 100 shares of Apple at the price of $100 per share. In finance, the technical term for this agreed price is the strike price. And for the privilege of buying the option to buy the stock in a year at $100, I need to pay the seller some money for that option. And he might demand a premium of $1,000 upfront right now for that contract. And if within a year Apple goes bankrupt or the stock price falls significantly, I don't have to buy anything at all. I'm just out of pocket the initial $1,000 premium I paid for the options contract. Now, if Apple shares are the same price they were last year, then the option contract doesn't grant me any benefit and I paid the $1,000 premium for nothing. But if Apple shares go up to $120, for example, that's a $2,000 increase in the trade position minus the $1,000 fee that I originally paid for the option contract, so I make a $1,000 profit overall. But since I only entered the trade with $1,000, I have functionally doubled my money. So instead of investing 10 grand and only making a 20% profit if the shares went up to 120, and I risk losing everything if Apple goes bankrupt, I've only invested 1 grand. I only risked 1 grand, but I make a 100% profit. Now, what I can do is say, okay, well, if I've got 10 grand to spend, well, I can actually just scale the trade up. So in financial terms, I can increase my exposure. I can buy 10 of these option contracts now instead of just buying 100 shares for the same price. So now if Apple rises to $120, I've made a $10,000 profit with the same investment as normal investors who just made $2,000 profit by buying the stock. So I've leveraged my profit fivefold. Now, of course, this is a rosy example because let's say Apple didn't go up in price to 120 and merely stayed the same, well, I would have lost my entire $10,000 investment. Whereas if I bought the stock outright, you wouldn't have lost anything. It would still be worth $10,000 and you still have $10,000 of Apple stock. You haven't lost anything. So this means with an option contract, I have a leverage position. I can protect myself from downside risk if the company goes bankrupt, and I can earn way more money if the stock moves up in a big way. But I can also just lose money if the stock doesn't do anything. So what happens is, if the stock price remains the same, the longer I hold this option, the more time value ticks out of it, like a ticking time bomb. It loses and loses and loses money the longer I hold onto it and the stock price doesn't move. So this evaporation of value out of the option contract has a financial term as well, and that term is theta. But let's now give another example. Let's say the stock isn't Apple, the stock is something else, something super volatile, for example, something to do with crypto. Well, the dude who's selling me the option contract is taking on more risk because the price is less predictable, so he wants to protect himself more in case the price increases a lot or decreases a lot. He doesn't know what's going to happen, so he wants to protect himself, and so he's going to charge a bigger fee, a bigger premium upfront to sell me the options contract. So the more volatile a stock is, the more I have to pay to buy an options contract for that stock. And what happens if I wanted the contract to be 2 years long instead of just 1 year? Well, the price has longer to do stuff. So Apple could go up really high in 2 years as opposed to 1 year. And Apple could go bankrupt over 2 years as opposed to just 1 year. There's more stuff that can happen in that time span. And so it's less predictable what's going to happen in 2 years than tomorrow. Tomorrow, the stock price is probably going to be more or less what it is today, give or take a few percent. But in 2 years, you don't really know what's going to happen. So then the options are going to be more expensive the more time value that is in the option. The financial term for how long an option runs for is the expiration date. So the expiration, the strike price, the volatility, they all affect the amount that I have to pay to buy this option. And the amount of options that I buy is the amount of exposure that I have. So what does any of this have to do with audio anyway? Well, I'm sure I'm not the only person who has ever noticed this, but I seem to be the first person who actually did it. But these concepts actually map onto audio compression absolutely perfectly. The price on the stock chart is just like the waveform of your audio signal. The strike price is just like the threshold of a compressor. The expiration date is just like the release time. The exposure is just like the ratio. The volatility is just like the dynamic range of the input signal. And then the amount of gain reduction actually applied to the audio signal is simply the price that I paid for the options contract. But instead of dollars, it's in decibels. It maps perfectly 1-to-1. So there's an undeniably gigantic conceptual overlap between the two, and the result is a sound which has never been heard before until I released curvature. You need to get it working at a kind of sweet spot level, and if you overdo it, the gain reduction will just skyrocket and tank the output level. And if you don't give it enough welly, you're not really going to hear that much of an effect. But if you get it in the sweet spot, you get this really edgy compression, which is extremely lively and organic, reacting violently with dynamic input signals and very gently with gentle input signals. It's extremely program dependent, frequency dependent. It's one of the most interesting types of compression that I have personally ever heard. And if you set it up just right, it can do really interesting sounds that people just haven't heard before. To me, it kind of sounds more alive, and it might sound stupid to say, but to me, it sounds almost more analog than what an analog compressor is doing, because an analog compressor, although it's analog, is still just doing normal, boring gain reduction most of the time, whereas this is doing something like weird, like some weird vintage recorder or something would do, like a wire recorder or something. It just freaks out in weird ways, and so it's almost more analog than your standard analog compressors, if that makes sense. And of course, you can only get it in curvature because, as far as I'm aware, nobody else has ever done this before. And the way that you do the calculation of the price of the option, and therefore the gain reduction applied in decibels instead of dollars, is with a formula called the Black-Scholes-Merton options pricing model. Hence why it's called the Black-Scholes compressor. And is one of the most important bits of math in the whole of finance. Specifically, it's a parabolic partial differential equation with the assumption that the stock price follows the geometric Brownian motion with the discounted stock price as a martingale. And if you want to know what that means, let me know in the comments. So the next novel compression algorithm which I decided to make was quantum tunneling. So we've discussed how certain concepts in finance map very nicely onto those in audio. But finance isn't the only field with similarities, and quantum physics also has cool stuff that we can borrow to create novel compression algorithms. Such is the case with quantum tunneling. So quantum tunneling is a phenomenon in quantum mechanics where a particle has a finite probability of crossing an energy barrier even if its classical energy is lower than the barrier's height. It happens because particles exhibit wave-like behavior, and the wave function describing the particle extends into and beyond the barrier, allowing a non-zero amplitude on the other side. So the result is that the particle can tunnel through the barrier instead of being reflected by it. To give an example that might be quite a lot easier to understand, if we blow up the scale from particle sizes to a much larger size and make a bit of an analogy out of it, it's kind of like a football that if you kick it up a steep hill, if it wasn't kicked with sufficient energy to make it up and over the hill, then it's just going to roll back down, right? It's not going to randomly end up on the other side of the hill, right? But in quantum mechanics, there is actually a non-zero chance that it will end up on the other side of the hill, even if it wasn't kicked with enough force to make it up and over the hill. So it will just suddenly appear on the other side of the hill. And that sounds completely bizarre and wrong because it's at a macro scale, and at that scale it doesn't really make any sense at all. But when you zoom into particle scale levels, really, really tiny stuff with just looking at electrons and stuff, it's actually what happens. So it's not just some new age quantum mysticism. This is actual real scientific fact that actually happens. So after reading up about quantum tunneling, I had some pretty enthusiastic ideas of how that could relate back to audio, specifically compression, and how in the same way as Black-Scholes seem to map onto a compressor well, we can map the same kind of mechanics as what's happening in quantum tunneling onto compression as well. So we can imagine that the energy of an electron flying into a barrier is kind of like the gain of a sample. Maybe it's the gain of a sample smashing into the threshold of a compressor. And the probability that the electron could tunnel through this barrier is kind of like the probability of some unit of gain reduction being applied to the signal. And these electrons, or aka units of gain reduction, could then compound over time, and the compounding is kind of like the attack phase of a compressor, building up the gain reduction, and that can be scaled up by some arbitrary attack coefficient set by the user, and then the rate of the dissipation of those electrons can then also be determined by an arbitrary time constant, and that's kind of like the release on a compressor. So curvature uses the exact academically correct mathematics to calculate the probability of a quantum tunneling event for every sample, and then the probability is tested against a random value in order to determine whether a tunneling event actually would occur or not in that model, and then the slewed signal is used in the regular way based off of that probability. So similar to the Black-Scholes algorithm that I wrote, it doesn't sound like any other type of compression, but it does sound like compression. It sounds really fresh and interesting, and again, you kind of need to find the sweet spot, and when you get that sweet spot, it doesn't sound like anything else, and it's one of the most interesting compression effects that you'll ever hear. It's got to be my favorite in curvature, and maybe I'll make something which becomes my new favorite, but right now quantum is definitely my favorite algorithm that I'm using, and you heard it earlier when I was making that beat with the sine waves. You could just take that sine wave and make something that sounded like a clap. No other compressor can do that, and it's down to the way that it tests the probability. So this probabilistic nature of the tunneling event, it's kind of like it can even create like white noise with really short time constants, and it's a really interesting effect that I just have never heard anything like it elsewhere. So yeah, I'm really chuffed about that quantum algorithm. Right now it's my favorite, but I'm working on some other new stuff, some novel types of compression, and you're going to see some other weird and wacky things in curvature because there's empty slots there that I'm filling up over time. So I'm going to release more and more updates over time until the whole thing is full with the most bonkers algorithms that you've never heard elsewhere. But let me know in the comments down below what kind of ideas you have, what you can map on from other kind of disciplines into audio. Could you imagine some kind of from aviation or from space or from some other field? Could you think of some kind of thing that you could map onto audio compression? And if your idea is really interesting, I might just build it. But anyway, that will do for now. By the time I've edited this course, it's probably going to be over 2 hours. So I think that's probably long enough for a single YouTube video. And I said I'd increase the difficulty until people start bailing. So hopefully most of you are not watching anymore at this point. And if you are, and you knew all of this already and want something more difficult, I can do a follow-up where we start just getting C++ out and starting coding. But I've got a feeling that most people are gonna have already had their fill long ago in this video, and most people wouldn't reach this point. So those guys who have known all of what I've been saying up until this point, probably in the minority. But if you did get this far, consider showing your appreciation by buying my compressor plugin, or if that's too much, consider grabbing something else from my website. Delta Expose is a fairly inexpensive plugin, and I've got some really nice higher value, reasonably priced courses and plugins starting at just €2 on my website. But that's it for now. Thanks for getting to the end of this course, and I really hope you learned some interesting stuff that you can take away and actually use in your own music.